Hello, and welcome to the QEM Heroes webinar series. I'm Christine Wood, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Heroes Fellows Program at QEM. For more than 30 years, QEM has been a national catalyst for STEM education transformation and research capacity building. Currently, the QEM network serves nearly 900 colleges and universities and reaches more than 8,000 individuals nationwide. This webinar is part of the HEROES initiative. The HEROES program brings together researchers with experience in the federal government to lend their expertise and support to the STEM research and education communities. Our fellows are here to provide tools and tips for navigating the funding landscape, developing STEM programs and partnerships, and improving talent retention in in-demand fields. We hope this series promotes engagement with our HEROES fellows and provides valuable resources to our participants. During the webinar, we invite you to use the Q&A tool to ask questions. And as a reminder, the webinar recordings and slides will be available in the QEM Resource Hub. By attending this webinar, you will be added to the QEM network and granted access to the Resource Hub. And I'm so happy to introduce our presenters today. Dr. Josh Trapani is a geoscientist who has spent the past 20 years working in federal science policy. His experiences include past roles at the National Science Foundation and the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics on Capitol Hill and with the Association of American Universities, a higher education association focused on federal advocacy on research and higher education issues. And Karen Ford Jackson is a grants and resource development professional with experience supporting federally funded education, innovation, and community development programs. She has held roles with the U.S. Department of Education as a management and program analyst, where she provided guidance to grant oversight, technical assistance, data-informed support to strengthen program performance, compliance, and strategic impact. And I'm so happy to turn the floor over to our presenters today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and we will get started. First slide, please. So today's webinar, we're going to focus on project budgets for grant proposals for education. Next slide, please. So preparing your budget for U.S. Department of Education grants. This is about telling your story through numbers. Welcome to our webinar. Today, we will spend some time learning how to craft and master the art of budgets for grant proposals. Next slide, please. So our objectives for today are understanding your ed budget requirements, identifying allowable versus unallowable cost, building a compliant, competitive budget, and avoiding common mistakes. Keeping in mind that budgets are not just numbers. They tell a story of your project. Remember, a strong budget aligns tightly with program goals and federal regulations. Next slide, please. So understanding the framework, the key regulations and budget components. The key regulations are 2 CFR Part 200, which is a part of the Uniform Guidance, as well as EDGAR's, which is the Education Department General Administration Regulations. And what you need to know about those key components, remember that the backbone to all federal grants is the uniform guidance. Always refer back to the uniform guidance as you're creating your budget. And should you have questions about ensuring that you're in compliance with what the guidance says. Budget components. The budget components are direct cost, indirect cost, and cost sharing if that is a requirement. Next slide, please. So as we look at the cost components, you have direct cost versus indirect cost. And for the direct cost, as you can see on the screen, those things are listed and they're very understandable. They're easy for you to be able to match information with those line items. As you look at your indirect costs, the indirect cost is a little more detailed because with the indirect costs, you have to make sure that you have an indirect cost rate agreement, or you can use the de minimis rate. And at Ed, what you would ensure that you do is reach out to the indirect cost team because there is a team that will help you not only get the agreement, but it will help you make sure that you filed your paperwork appropriately and that you're following the guidance. Because for some of the indirect cost, some of them are capped at 8% if you are applying for any of the training grants. So keep all of those things in mind as you're doing that. Next slide, please. So, as we're thinking about the cost principles, so you want to think about, is this allowable or is this unallowable? For allowable cost principles, you want to make sure that you're answering the questions of, is this necessary for my project? Is this reasonable? And is this allocable? Those are the questions you want to ask as you're creating this budget and thinking about what the costs are. And you also want to look at being consistent with the policy. Again, you've got to refer back to the uniform guidance to ensure that you're following what the policy says. Unallowable is very easy. You know, you can't pay for entertainment. Alcohol is not accepted. Lobbying, paying for fines, or paying for any penalties. And one of the things you want to think about and I'm sorry, I meant to mention this in the last slide, but all of those areas, your personnel, remember that it's always tied directly to your project activities. You want to make sure that you always reflect the actual effort. Your fringe benefits are always used for your organization's negotiated rate. Your travel, it must be necessary and reasonable. If you're attending a conference, say there's a project directors conference in DC, then you know that that's something that's allowable, and you want to make sure that you're attending those conferences. Equipment is defined as $5,000 per unit. That's the threshold. However, sometimes with equipment, you can always negotiate some of the things, particularly if you make sure that you're ensuring it's tied to your project goals and objectives. That's going to be your key, ensuring that the information is tied to your project goals and objectives. Supplies meets the same threshold as any equipment. Contracts, you know, those are for your consultants, your evaluators, and you must follow any procurement standards. And other is for participant support, your stipends, and all of those kinds of things. So, and make sure that as you're looking at allowable costs, that is essential to your project. Always ask yourself, is this essential to my project? And again, refer back to 200 CFR 200 subpart E will always give you the answers as to what's allowable, what seems to be reasonable. And again, as you're working and building those relationships with your program officer, there are often times where things can be allowed that haven't been allowed because you've tied it back to it impacting your project goals and objectives. Next slide, please. So your budget narrative. Your budget narrative is what's going to tell your story. Your budget narrative and your budget template are going to tell the story. You want these things to match. If you said you were doing it in one place, you want to make sure it matches the other. You want to make sure your tables are exactly precise. You want to ensure that your calculations are accurate and correct. And these are areas where you really need to be working with your finance team to ensure that there are no inconsistencies with those calculations. And you also want to make sure, again, Everything has to tie back to your activities. It's like you're putting a puzzle together. Everything needs to fit in that puzzle as you're building it and putting it together. Make sure that you're answering the why behind each cost. As you're looking at what you're spending, why am I spending this? Is it tied back to my project goals and objectives? Will anyone have any questions about this? Am I clear about what I'm saying about this project, the numbers that I'm putting in here, and who's being paid? The other thing, as you list your personnel, always make sure that you put the percent of time, the FTE for personnel who are doing the work, because that's also critical to, as we look at salaries and those things, make sure that you always include the FTE. Next slide, please. So, spot the problem. Our chat should be open for you. And I am going to read these. We're going to start with the first one. In a proposal, the applicant provided a budget that listed the following items. Consultant, $50,000. Which answer will you choose? A, missing details. B, sufficient information provided. C, not allowed.
And the chat is open for you to submit responses. We have one vote for B, one vote for A. Looks like it's split between B and A in the responses.
Okay, so let's unpack this for a second. Remember in the prior slides how critical it is that you provide all the details. There is missing information because all it says is $50,000 for a consultant. So what is the consultant doing? Is the work tied back to the project? Again, it's very, very important that you list details. More information is better than less. Because if you provide enough information, then that leads to less questions because everyone is on the same page and people know what you're doing. So for this one, you could say consultant, providing direct support to students that are in the program that tie back to the goals and objectives of the project that we're implementing. And those are the kinds of things you want. You want to make sure that it's crafted in a way that anybody who picks this up can read it and understand exactly what this consultant fee is for and what those persons are doing. Let's look at the second one, travel. For travel is listed a concert for $300,000. Is that an allowable cost or is it an unallowable cost? And please explain your answer. So there is a question, is that sufficient for the general budget, not the narrative? So the narrative explains what your budget says, but oftentimes, when I was at the department, I've had people that in that consultant, they put in parentheses a further detail of what that consultant fee is for. So you can do it both places. It can be in the narrative and it can be on the template.
And there seems to be a consensus in the chat that concert's an unallowable cost, and it's clearly defined as an unallowable cost because entertainment is not allowed.
Absolutely. Fantastic. So you're absolutely correct. For that, concerts are certainly not allowable cost. So that would not be funded and would be eliminated from the budget line items. Thank you for your participation, and let's move to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about cost sharing or match. And I'm just going to talk about it very briefly because all applications don't necessarily require cost sharing or match. But if they do require that, ensure that you're providing all the documents and letters to support your cost sharing and or match, ensuring that these costs are certainly allowable. And the other key component, you just want to make sure that this cost is not counted elsewhere in the budget. The other thing about cost sharing and or match, if in the NIA it says for you, which is the notice of inviting applicants, if it says that you have to match 100% of the dollars, that's exactly what it means. If they're giving you $100,000, your match should be $100,000, and you should show that. If it is cost sharing where they're sharing a portion of the cost, then whatever cost that you say they're sharing, you need to ensure that you are providing those items, the letters that you ensure that they provide those amounts, because what will happen, they will check for each budget year to make sure that it's adding up. If you said they were going to cost share at 50%, you want to make sure you're cost sharing at the 50%. If you said 10%, you want to make sure that you're cost sharing at the 10%. But again, you need to refer back to the notice for inviting applicants, because not all applications are requiring a cost sharing and or a match. Next slide, please. So let's think about common pitfalls and best practices. You really want to be mindful of your math errors. Make sure that your numbers are adding up. And ensure that you're working closely with your budget person so that all those numbers are matching. Even your indirect costs, make sure that you're using the applicable indirect costs and that you are calculating those numbers correctly. Make sure that your budget does not differ from your narrative, because those are also some common pitfalls. You want to make sure that they're telling the story together. Um, and make sure that you're not ignoring caps and or limits on budget line items. And don't provide vague descriptions. Make sure that you're very descriptive in what you say you're going to do, how you're paying for it in those budget line items, because all of that information is scrutinized. Best practices: start early, collaborate with your finance team, collaborate. Attend all informational webinars about the grants that you're applying for, because that is going to make sure that is going to ensure that you're following all of the guidance. And always refer back to the notice for inviting applicants, because then you will know that everything that you're doing is following what's in that guidance. And oftentimes in that notice for inviting applicants, there's a checklist. Make sure that you're using that checklist, you're checking the boxes, and you have everything that you need. Prior to turning all of your information in, go back to that checklist and ensure that you have checked every box. You have everything that is needed. Double, triple, quadruple check your math and make sure that everything is in alignment. Use all the templates that are provided, because they're provided for you so that you can, in fact, keep everything honest, and you can provide all the information that is needed so that you ensure you're at least in the running for the funding. Double and triple and quadruple check again your calculations. That's so important, because oftentimes that is what throws people in a bind, is those calculations are way off. Make sure that your work is aligned with your project timeline. Make sure that everything is in alignment. If you do that, your puzzle is put together perfectly, and you will have a chance or the opportunity for solidifying the funds. And with that being said, we're going to give a few minutes for questions very quickly if there are any questions. And if not, I'm going to turn it over to, oh, I'm sorry, tools and resources. This is an important page. I've shared links for you to go on. Because now there are a lot of interagency agreements, and it's important that you go to that grants.gov. It will give you information. Ed.gov has lots of information about the grant forecast. And the last piece is about some of the new announcements and the additional partnerships that change some of the trajectory for grant funding. So I hope that this was informative. It gave you some tools for you all to think about and do great with your next proposal.
Thanks.
Again, any questions very quickly, and we will move on to Josh. And thank you so much for attending.
Thanks for your portion of the talk, Karen. If anyone has any questions, you are free to put them in the Q&A box. You're also allowed to come off mute if you raise your hand, or you can use the chat. We'll move on to Josh's portion of the presentation once we address some questions and have a bit of a discussion from Karen's presentation. And I'll wait just a minute or so to see if anyone has a question or comment. Well, there will certainly be time for more questions at the end of the presentation. For now, we're going to turn the floor over to Josh.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right. Thanks, Christine, and thanks, Karen. There was really a ton of great information in Karen's presentation, and I think as I go through my slides, you're going to hear me hit some very similar notes that to what she did, with the biggest difference being that I'm going to focus on proposals, budget proposals for the National Science Foundation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a few caveats, and then I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how to think about your NSF proposal budget. So we'll take a look at the route your proposal takes when it gets to the agency and what different people see the proposal and what they're going to be looking for. We'll talk a little bit about what you want to achieve with your budget, and also what some pitfalls that you might want to avoid. Then we'll dig into the budget itself, looking at the structure of it and the different categories. And I'll end by pointing to some resources and providing a little advice for further help. So before we go any further, I did want to provide a couple of caveats. NSF has different types of proposals, and sometimes the requirements can differ a bit. So there are some specialized types of proposals that I'm not going to be talking about. There may be some program or solicitation specific requirements. I'm not going to be talking about collaborative proposals. This is intended as a general introduction, and it will apply to the vast majority of NSF proposals, but I just want to put that out there. Second, just a little about me. I spent about 5.5 years at NSF, but I only spent about a year as a program officer. I have seen many proposal budgets and interacted with them, analyzed them, negotiated them with PIs and all of that. But I did want to say that my perspective might be different from, is someone, Karen, can you mute for me? Thanks. I did want to say that my perspective might be different from someone who's been doing it for 20 years. So if there's anybody like another one of the Heroes Fellows on who has been a program officer for a long time and would like to augment or challenge anything that I say, please feel free to chime in at the end. And then finally, I can't really emphasize two things enough, and it's going to come up again and again in my presentation, and Karen emphasized her equivalent of it too, especially if you're new to preparing proposal budgets. First, read the agency guidance. Go to the NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, the PAPG, and read the relevant sections. I've got links at the end of my presentation. I won't be able to cover absolutely everything. I don't know every single one of the rules. Second, I would say, again, this is reiterating something that Karen emphasized, talk to people at your institution as you're getting ready to prep your proposal. Do this early and make sure that your efforts are aligned with your institutional policies. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's take a quick look at the pathway your proposal will take. This schematic doesn't really show what happens before you submit your proposal over here, but it does show what happens after when it comes to the National Science Foundation. It's going to face different kinds of scrutiny from different people. One of the first things that will happen when it gets to the agency is the administrative staff will do a compliance check on your proposal to make sure that you've met some of the basic requirements around length and formatting. The program officer will look at the proposal, looking at it from the perspective of the science, but also making sure that it all sort of fits together and makes sense. The proposal will be sent out for peer review. That may include ad hoc review, which is sort of done by correspondence, or a panel review, or some combination of the two. And those reviewers will be peers who are experts who will be looking both at the science and to make sure that your budget and the other pieces make sense. If it comes back favorably, the program officer may recommend an award, at which point it will go to the division leadership and they will take a quick look at it and make sure that they concur with the decision. And they'll be looking at a range of factors, including the budget. We call that DD concur. If the proposal is then recommended for award, it will go to NSF's Division of Grants and Agreements, what we call DGA, and they will also look it over very carefully, particularly giving scrutiny to the budget before the final award is made and goes back to your organization. So the take-home message here is that your budget is going to go to different audiences, both before and after submission. And those audiences are going to be looking for and they're going to care about different things. And you want to make sure that it can please all of those people, give them what it is that they're looking for without tripping any wires. It's important to remember that we're talking about taxpayer money, and there is a lot of emphasis on accountability and responsibility. If you keep that in mind while you're preparing your budget, it will definitely help. If you receive an NSF award, you are, in a sense, being entrusted with taxpayer dollars. And so then it's important to give the American taxpayer the best value for the money that you can. And there are a lot of people who are going to be watching to make sure that that's the case. Okay, so you want to make your budget the strongest it can be. So here are some things to think about it. And again, I'm going to be echoing what Karen said in a number of different ways. You want to explain how much it will cost by year to accomplish the research plan you're proposing. So if you're proposing working for 2 years, you'll have sort of two pages that break out the years. If it's 5 years, you'll have 5 pages. You want to break out these costs by category, and we'll talk about the categories in a few minutes. And you want to explain and justify all of those costs. You want to make sure that your budget aligns closely with your proposed research plan. Like Karen said, it's like fitting together the pieces of a puzzle. You want them to all fit together. You don't want anybody to be reading your project description and then go into your budget and not quite understanding how the two are going to work together or how you got from one to the other. You want to ask for what you need. Well, you don't want to ask for a lot more than what you need, but you need to ask for enough to make sure that you can actually complete the work you're proposing to do. From my experience with the process, shaving a little bit off what you ask for is not going to make it any more likely that your proposal is going to be awarded. And of course, you want to make sure to follow the rules and the guidelines, and that will include rules that your university has, the Fed-wide rules like the uniform guidance that Karen talked about, NSF guidelines, as well as anything that is solicitation or program specific. The flip side of this are things to avoid. Again, the list that Karen showed is really very relevant here, but I wanted to highlight or reiterate a few things. You want to avoid failing to explain what you need the money for and also why. You want to be really clear, I need this and this is what I'm going to do with it. Being unrealistically high or low in your estimated costs. The example that I have heard others from NSF give is they'll read a project description and get to the end and see that the PI is proposing 2 graduate students to help do the work, and they'll think, oh my God, they need 20 graduate students to do this work. And while that might be sort of an exaggerated example, it just kind of shows you have to think about the ballpark, make sure you land sort of in the right area with what it is that you are estimating. Leaving things out or inconsistencies with the proposal narrative. Again, we talked about this. You want all the pieces to sort of work together and reinforce each other. And if you ask for something or mention something in the project description, you need to make sure it's in the budget too, or it's going to raise questions. failing to follow the rules or the guidance. We've talked about this a number of times. And, when in doubt, ask for help. We'll talk at the very end about how you might do that. And then I put this is a little bit tongue in cheek, triggering an audit, but it's just designed to remind you that we're talking about taxpayer funds. That a lot of people are going to be looking at your budget, and some of them are not really going to be science people, but they are going to be looking to try to protect their organization, and that includes the agency, and that will include your institution as well. And you want to make sure you're not doing anything to trigger a lot of scrutiny or raise eyebrows in that regard. Okay, so now let's pivot and talk about the structure of your budget. In your proposal, the budget section is going to have two components. First is the budget sheet itself. The budget uses for NSF, we'll use NSF Form 1030. We're going to take a more detailed look at that in a minute. You will provide 1 page per year proposed, as we talked about. If it's 2 years, 2 pages. If it's 5 years, 5 pages. So somebody can kind of follow year by year what it is you're proposing to do for the arc of your work. It will break out the budget into specific categories that we will talk about in a minute. And it will include the specific dollars that you are requesting for each category for each year. The second part of your budget will be the budget justification. This is a narrative document. You have up to 5 pages to provide it, and you may as well use as much of it as you need. You want here to explain where the costs come from and justify why they're necessary to accomplish the work. So you are both informing your reader what it is you need here, and you are persuading them that indeed this is what you need to accomplish the work you're proposing to do. Ideally, this budget narrative follows the same order as the budget categories on the form. That will make it really easy for people to go back and forth and sort of follow along with you. The dollar amounts should match. Karen emphasized rechecking and rechecking your calculations. You don't want anybody to just be questioning things just because you have 2 different numbers that are supposed to be representing the same thing, and it creates confusion. And be sure to include every category you're asking for in the budget. So if you are asking for a $10,000 piece of equipment in your budget, make sure you mention that piece of equipment in the budget narrative and explain why you need that piece of equipment in order to accomplish the work. So these 2 parts, they need to work together and with your project description to make your case without tripping any wires. Okay, so now let's take a look at the budget categories in more detail. Here you can see a blow up of that NSF Form 1030. If any of you have ever been an NSF peer reviewer, you've probably seen this form as part of each proposal. And the form breaks out these categories of costs, which you will probably note are very close to the ones Karen spoke about. They tend to be fairly consistent federal wide. So I'm going to talk about each of these for a few minutes in the NSF context. But before that, I wanted to say a few words about indirect costs. I'm not going to talk about indirect costs again after this slide. So indirect costs are based on a rate that is negotiated between your institution and the federal government. You may have seen and heard in the news about some of the federal science agencies trying to lower or change those rates. For this year, my understanding is those rates have not changed. It seems potentially unlikely that they will in the future, but it remains to be seen. But the important thing is that your sponsor project office will help you calculate this, and it's for a few reasons. First of all, you may need some help determining which of the things you are requesting are direct costs versus indirect costs, and I'll touch on that as we go through these other categories. Second of all, it can be a little bit more complicated than just multiplying your total direct costs by the reimbursement rate. Even some of your direct costs may not be included in the calculation. If you have ever heard research administrators talking about modified total direct costs, or MTDC, that's where this sort of difference comes in. And third, there is a separate cap of 26% on certain administrative costs. So the take-home message on an indirect cost is your institution is going to help you here. Let's now go through the direct cost categories. I'm going to briefly give you some highlights from the NSF perspective, and then I will once again reiterate that there is no substitute for looking at the PAPG and talking to your sponsored projects office. Okay, let's talk about personnel. Personnel refers to the people who will be working on your project, and that includes you if you are the PI. NSF divides personnel into two different general categories with different rules and requirements for each. The first is senior personnel. Senior personnel includes the PI, co-PIs, any other senior or key people. You can request a certain amount of salary support for those people. There is a limitation that you should not be requesting more than 2 months of their regular salary, and that is across all NSF grants. So that if you have multiple NSF grants coming to a single PI or senior personnel, it shouldn't total more than 2 months of regular salary. And then there are other personnel. Other personnel include postdocs, grad and undergrad students, some lab professionals like techs and programmers. It can also include certain secretarial and clerical work as well. For this subcategory, you need to list the numbers of people, the person months for postdocs, like how many month equivalent efforts they're going to be putting in, and the total salaries. And again, that'll be year by year. So if you have varying numbers of students working on your project over different years, that will be manifest in the different pages of the budget document. Now, beyond salaries and wages, people also receive fringe benefits like leave, employee insurance, Social Security, and retirement. Um, the calculation for that is going to follow your institutional policies. Typically, it is a rate for the particular class of employee that you're talking about applied to how much salary and wage is requested. And I put a note here that some items, like some of the fringe and potentially some of the clerical salaries, may be considered indirect costs. These are things that your university should just be generally providing, and they will not be charged directly. This again will depend on your institutional policy. Next is equipment. For the purposes of putting together your budget, you can think of equipment as property that lasts for more than a year, has a value of greater than about $5,000. Usually, we're talking here about research equipment or some other apparatus that's not already available for the conduct of the work. When we think about general sort of office furniture and equipment or computer IT equipment, typically that's not eligible for direct cost support because it is considered part of the support that the university is supposed to give through indirect cost reimbursement. If you need some kind of specialized software or specialized computer equipment, that's a different matter, and that may potentially count. Travel. So travel includes field work, attendance at meetings and conferences, any other travel associated with the proposed work. As you can see on the form, you need to separate domestic, which actually includes Canada, Mexico, and US possessions, from other foreign travel, and know that if you propose a lot of foreign travel, there will be a bit more scrutiny. So you have to, cross all your T's and dot all your I's on that. There are some other rules about conference attendances and booking air travel and things like that in the PAPG. This is a place where it's important to explain and to justify. So if you say, I'm going to build into my budget that myself and two of my grad students are going to go to this conference next year, that's fine. But remember to include in your narrative a sentence about why it's important for the three of you to go to that conference in order to complete the work that you are proposing. Another thing to note, as I said, I wasn't going to talk about program and solicitation specific stuff, but I did want to say some programs or solicitations will require anybody who is a PI to travel to, let's say, an annual convening or workshop associated with the program or solicitation. If that's the case, this is the place where you want to put the expenses for that. And that's the kind of thing your program officer will hopefully help you double check to make sure that somehow they fund you and yet you can't travel to the mandatory meeting. But it's something to think about as you're putting together your budget. Okay, participant support. Participant support can be a tricky area sometimes. So I put in here a direct quote from the PAPG. This budget category refers to direct costs for items such as stipends or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, and registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees, in connection with NSF-sponsored conferences or training projects. So we're not talking about project personnel here. we're talking about other people who are participating in events or training. So, for example, if you are running a research experiences for undergraduates project, an REU project, those participants would be things for them would be included here under participant support and not under personnel. It may very well be that you do not have any of this in your proposal. But if you do, just be careful. This is an area that I have heard tends to invite more scrutiny from DGA as well when it's going through. And finally, we have other direct costs. These are broken out into materials and supplies, direct costs associated with publication, documentation, dissemination, consultant services, which is when you will bring in an expert to do a piece of the work for you, computer services, subawards, which is when you actually sort of subcontract a piece of the work to another organization, and then other. If you're going to do a subaward, that's kind of a whole other thing. The subawardee will have to provide some separate documentation. There are some cases in which you'll need to work with your institution to determine what is direct and what is indirect in terms of these other costs. So, for instance, materials and supplies can be a little bit of a gray area. One other note that I wanted to make sure to include here is, NSF proposals are going to be evaluated based on two criteria: intellectual merit and broader impacts. So in your proposal, you're going to have to propose some broader impacts activities. Make sure to build those activities. If they have a cost associated with them, make sure to build those activities into your budget. NSF is able to and should be quite willing to give you resources to accomplish not just the intellectual merit part of your proposal, but also the broader impacts part of your proposal. So it would be good in the narrative perhaps to break that out, so that reviewers could understand, but don't be shy about asking for resources for broader impacts. Okay, so this is my last slide, and I just wanted to say, don't be shy about seeking help either. Um, you should be reaching out to your university sponsored projects office or whatever is the most appropriate office on your campus for help and review. A lot of these offices want to see proposals at the very least a few days before they go in so that they can review them and make sure everything looks okay. It's better to open the lines of communication early. Sort of, this is the similar point to Karen was making. Open up those lines of communication and be really transparent as you're preparing a proposal. It can only help because your institution is an important partner with you on that. I have heard the person who led for a very long time NSF's policy office suggest that PIs, especially newer PIs, give their proposal, including their budget, to a colleague for review before they submit it. And that's part of what's going to happen when it comes to NSF anyway. It's going to go out for merit review. But you can ask a colleague to review your proposal, and you can ask them to look at it through the lens of, do all these pieces fit together? Does this all make sense? Do you see any inconsistency? And at least from the perspective of a peer reviewer, you would get a perspective. Feel free to check in with your NSF program officer if you have questions that you think they can help answer. And then I just wanted to say that the Heroes Fellows are also here as a resource for you always. We have different backgrounds. You can look us up on QEM's website. I put in a link where you can set up a time to talk to me if you want to, but there may be others who are more appropriate depending upon what question you have. And then finally, I put a few online resources. There are a few from NSF, including link directly to the appropriate part of the PAPG. The National Council of University Research Administrators, or NACURA, has a ton of online videos and resources that look at preparing different parts of an NSF proposal, including the budget. It's a really good resource. I found a nice presentation from Montana State about preparing a budget for your NSF proposal. That's a really good point of view from the institution's perspective, and just listening to it's about 20 minutes. If you listen to what they say, you get kind of an idea of the mindset that your institutional administrators might have about this. And then if you'd like to see a few examples of budgets and budget narratives for NSF, I found some on the Appalachian State website that I thought you might be useful as well. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and we can take any questions for Karen or for me.
And I'll direct you to this closing slide as well. You have three QR codes. One of them leads you to the QEM events page where you can see our upcoming webinars. The other leads you to the Heroes webpage where you can contact our Heroes Fellows directly. And the other is a webinar feedback form to evaluate our presentation today. Thank you so much. And we have a question in the chat. Josh, you may have mentioned this, but if a PI is on two or more separate NSF grants, can requested personnel costs equal 2 months of regular salary in total across multiple grants, or a max of 2 months for each grant?
Yeah, it's a total across all of the grants. That is my understanding.
And we're happy to take additional questions in the QA. Here we go.
Is there a
Lena
question?
Arnold asks, is there a rule on the percent that can be put in the other or miscellaneous category?
I don't think there's a, this is a question for me, I think. I don't think there's a rule about the percent, but you would have to say sort of what it is and why it doesn't fit into any of the other categories, and certainly um explain what it is.
I agree with Josh on that. You do have to make sure that you have some detailed explanations about what this other is and how it aligns with your project goals and objectives.
And we'll hold on for a minute or so to allow people to ask any questions they might have. I am also putting a link for the webinar evaluation into our chat.
Yeah, I would say if there are other related topics that anybody attending would like to hear Karen and I or other fellows speak about that are kind of related to this. If you wanted to put them in the chat or let us know now, or you could email us afterwards, I think that that would be really useful. The two of us, and I think a lot of the other fellows, are always looking to try to make these webinars as relevant and engaging for you as we possibly can. So if there are areas where you'd like to hear some more, it'd be great to get that.
Craig has a question in the chat. The 2 months total for NSF is interesting. I think this is more of a comment. I've never heard this for other agencies as they want to make sure enough effort is allocated to the project to actually do it. This seems like it would encourage the opposite. Essentially, this is a cap to 2 to 3 total NSF grants at a time.
Yeah, I think that, if you're coming more from the NIH perspective, NSF tends not to be supporting whole people's salaries. They expect the institution for PIs to be kicking in. Um, and then somebody says that that can be waived or negotiated, which also may be the case.
And Jessica Goodman says, thank you for clarity in addressing the budget areas. Some information was reminders that can be sometimes overlooked as PIs are being more attentive to the content of the proposals and less on the budget. And this is something I've heard before that people don't treat it like an iterative process. They treat it more like budget's an afterthought. And I think you both did a great job clarifying that that shouldn't be the way it's approached. Okay, well, in the absence of additional questions or discussion points, I want to thank our presenters once again. Please head to the QEM events page on our website to sign up for additional webinars coming up. We have a full slate of webinars for the rest of the month and every month thereafter. Thank you so much.